His fight has given us the opportunity we were denied when his brothers John and Robert were taken from us. The blessing of time to say thank you and goodbye.
Don't you find it remarkable that one of the most partisan liberal men in the last century serving in the Senate had so many of his foes embrace him?
The president and the vice president reacting to the death of Senator Ted Kennedy, who died at his home in Hyannisport last night, exactly 1 year, almost to the hour, after he delivered a speech at the Democratic National Convention in Denver, the last big speech he would deliver. Let's bring in our panel now. Bill Kristol, editor of the Weekly Standard; Kirsten Powers, columnist of the New York Post; and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. Bill, your thoughts on his life and legacy?
That's difficult. My condolences to his family, obviously. I wasn't a big fan of his politics, and I didn't really admire him, so maybe I won't say very much, you know. I mean, in terms of his politics, though, just to get away from the personal stuff, he was a liberal. He didn't change at all in the 47 years that he was in the United States Senate, and some people might regard that as admirable consistency. I frankly would regard that as being blind to reality and refusing to learn from facts. You know, he continued to advocate policies that had long ago been proven, in my view, not to work. And the one thing, leaving again aside his personal life, the one thing I really would not forgive him for was the speech denouncing Robert Bork totally unfairly. He was entitled to oppose Robert Bork when he was nominated for the Supreme Court, but this famous speech in which he made it seem as if Bob Bork was in favor of segregating blacks and discriminating against people was really not a low point in modern American politics.
Do you buy the talk today that he was very effective behind closed doors in the Senate to make things happen?
He was a good negotiator, and I certainly knew plenty of senators and people in the Bush administration who negotiated with him. He knew when to give in a little bit. He didn't obstinately stick to the absolute straight liberal line, and he kept his word, I think, in political negotiations in the Senate. In that respect, he was a very effective liberal United States senator.
Kirsten?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that that's something that a lot of people feel is missing in the health care debate, and then there's been a lot of discussion of what the health care debate might have been like without him, if he was able, you know, you have people like Orrin Hatch coming out and saying that they feel that he was somebody who actually could work with Republicans and would find some way to have some consensus versus the way it's being done now. I'm a little skeptical about that, considering the tenor of politics right now and the way things are on the Hill. You know, in terms of, you know, his legacy and who he is, I have a slightly different take, of course, than Bill. You know, as a Democrat going up in this country, the Kennedys were always really represented this sort of royalty of the Democrats, this, you know, very, well, I mean, he was more liberal, I guess, than his brothers, but people who were very privileged but still felt an obligation to give back to the country. They obviously loved this country very much, whether you agree with their politics or not. And I think that, you know, being an unabashed liberal in the way that he was, and being a really vocal person who could talk about things like health care as a human right, was something that I think is going to be missing with him gone. You mentioned health care. Here's just a snippet from that speech at the Democratic National Convention.
This is the cause of my life, new hope, that we will break the old gridlock and guarantee that every American, north, south, east, west, young, old, will have decent, quality health care as a fundamental right and not a privilege.
Charles, he used that line in many speeches throughout his career. What about his role in the health care debate and what Democrats should or could do in his passing?
Well, I suspect they'll name the bill after him as a way to gather sentimental support. I'm not sure it'll have much of an effect. But in looking at him and his legacy, I would take the middle road, the high road, between Kirsten and Bill. Look, this was the most important senator since Lyndon Johnson, and I would say the most important senator in American history who never became majority leader. And he was the titular and the de facto head of American liberalism as an ideology. And trying to look at it as a future historian might, I think they might say that his political life marks and heavily influenced the trajectory of American liberalism. In a sense, they might conclude that he was one of its champions, but he took it too far. He overshot. I'll give you two examples. Civil rights, he and his brother Bobby were early, dedicated, and sincere champions, courageous of civil rights. But Teddy took it into affirmative action and reverse discrimination, which were more highly problematic. Secondly was in the social safety net. He was a strong supporter of Social Security, extending it to the disabled, Medicare, children's health. But he took it way into the Great Society, which created a whole culture of dependency, which ironically had to be undone by a moderate Democrat, President Clinton. In that speech that we saw, the most famous he ever gave of "The Dream Will Never Die," that was not a speech given against Reagan or a right-winger. It was given against the moderate Jimmy Carter. And he represented the extreme liberalism in a sense. And in a sense, that's why the Democrats were denied the White House for almost all of the last 50 years, with the exception of Clinton and Carter, the likes of whom Kennedy opposed.
Bill, do you think that that old-style politics around personality and relationships is over?
In the Senate? No. No. But, you know, Teddy Kennedy also challenged a sitting Democratic president, Jimmy Carter, and I approve of that, since it probably made it easier for Ronald Reagan to beat him. So that was another contribution Ted Kennedy has made to American history.
Didn't your former boss, Dan Quayle, work with Ted Kennedy?
He did, and look, I mean, I dealt with Senator Kennedy a fair amount, you know, sporadically in those years when I was Dan Quayle's chief of staff, and I did my job, and I dealt with him professionally, and he was professional to me, and he had a real charm. I mean, and if one was just willing to ignore what one knew about his history, his personal history, one could, I think, be quite charmed by him, and in any case, he was pleasant. And I want to say, I do think it was one foreign trip he went on with Air Force Two with the Vice President to Latin America. And I've got to say, there was a glimpse of that older liberalism there that I very much associate with with John Kennedy especially. I was briefing him and the Vice President and others on the trip, and the national security people were briefing him. And I said something to Senator Kennedy, you may not agree with the administration on this. He said, at least this was 1990 or so, he said, you know, look, we're traveling abroad together. We'll represent the United States together. I'll follow the Vice President's lead. He didn't adhere to that, honestly. I'd say in the next 20 years, he bitterly attacked President Bush over Iraq, quite unfairly, I think. But I've got to say, at that moment, one saw a glimpse of an earlier sort of American politics where there was real bipartisanship in foreign policy.
Well, go to foxnews.com for all the information on Ted Kennedy's life and legacy. You can visit our interactive section you see here for a timeline and a 45-picture photo essay online. We'll look at the CIA Inspector General's report about enhanced interrogations next, and what influence Dick Cheney may have had when we come back.